there's one study I was just talking earlier about like effect size and sample size. There was a study that surveyed over 2,000 recreational marathoners, and it found that weekly volume was the strongest predictor of race performance. So for those people who were running 50 miles a week, they were 25 to 32 minutes faster than those running 30 miles per week, all else equal. And then if you go down and you look at intensity, those same people were sampled. And they found that in that same group of marathoners, those who incorporated intervals regularly, so those who were doing intensity beyond just easy mileage, they only ran about 5 minutes faster. Still important, still meaningful, but way secondary to the gains that you can get from volume alone.
That was Alex Ostberg today, breaking down the last 4 editions of the Rundown by The Running Effect, our state-of-the-art newsletter where we dive into training principles, mindset, culture hacks, everything and anything in regards to excellence in the sport of running, as well as principles that you can apply directly into your life as well. Every month, Alex and I sit down and we break down the last 4 editions of the Rundown. If you're not familiar with Alex, he is currently an assistant coach with Nike Swoosh Track Club based in Eugene, Oregon, and he ran for Stanford and the University of North Carolina back in the day. Today, we dive into the science of tapering and how to taper properly, as well as a bunch of questions that come with that, as well as the hierarchy of endurance needs when the magic fades, meaning when your season isn't going as well as you would have hoped, or the season after your best season, how to bounce back from the expectations that come with PRs and championships. And then we dive into, lastly, the behaviors of championship teams, where Alex writes extensively about his years on the Stanford cross country team. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. This one is always value packed. Anytime I sit down with Alex, there's always so much value. And today's 49 minute conversation is going to leave you with probably pages of notes that you can apply directly into your running and into your life. And if you enjoy it, guys, subscribe to our newsletter. I've left 2 links in the show notes. It is completely free to subscribe to, and we've already had over $1,000 pledged yearly and people who would pay us for this type of content. And we're going to keep it free because we want to provide free value for you all out there. But I highly recommend subscribing. The fact that people are willing to pay money for this sort of thing shows how valuable and impactful it can be. And because it's free, you can unsubscribe at any time. We release 1 edition weekly, so we're not flooding your inbox. 1 edition every single Thursday. And I'm confident it is high leverage content in your inbox that you don't get anywhere else. Subscribe in the show notes below and shoot me a DM. Let me know your thoughts on this podcast, on previous newsletters, ways that you think we can improve, or subjects you want us to tackle. And without further ado, enjoy the wisdom and knowledge of the man, the myth, the legend, the writer behind the Rundown by The Running Effect, Mr. Alex Ostberg. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back a month later, recapping the last 4 pieces of the Rundown by The Running Effect, also written by the man sitting across from me, Alex Ostberg. Alex, how you doing, man?
Doing well. Back up in Park City. We'll be departing for Tokyo in a few weeks for the World Championships, so had to make sure we got this recording in with ample time to spare before I was going to board that Trans-Pacific flight.
What's your experience flying across, not, I was going to say the country, the world? Is it pretty painful, or do you enjoy it? How do you get your sleep?
I have some Norwegian heritage. My dad's Norwegian, and would spend every summer growing up, we'd usually spend, me and my family, like 3, 4, 5, sometimes even 6 weeks in Norway. So I got pretty accustomed to long transatlantic flights, but the nature of those is that they're a lot shorter. I have never actually gone west. I've never been to Asia, so this is going to be a new experience. I'm generally fine on planes. I actually sometimes value the opportunity to just like have tunnel vision, have no distractions, and just get things done. It's either that
Only you
or
would say
I
that.
need to.
Only you look
Well,
around on a plane and everyone's like eating their unhealthy, cancerous foods and binge watching their TV show, and Alex probably has like celery root juice and is grinding on a science project.
I'm still a sucker for the airplane snack sometimes, but from a productivity standpoint, maybe I'm a little above average.
Biscoff cookies, number 1, or something else?
Those have been pretty good. Delta's been distributing Sun Chips recently, which just kind of have hit the spot a couple of times. But the Biscoffs are pretty good, Sun Chips, and then also Delta's been doing Cheez-Its. So it just kind of depends. I mean, none of them are very satiating, but I just get hungry on planes, and sometimes that snack hits the spot.
Before we hop into the 4 editions, I actually have a bonus question for the listeners out there, as a little thank you for listening and spending time with us. that relates to something that happened to me yesterday. I know you're fully unprepared for this, but you're kind of always prepared with the amount of information in your brain, and it actually relates to travel. So, um, this past weekend, I was right outside of Cleveland. We were doing event marketing for a Hoka gig. I had like back to back nights of like 6 hour nights. I don't think I've ever been so tired yesterday. And I started to feel like in the back of my throat, like a little sore throat. And I had to swallow my pride and say, don't set an alarm clock and try to sleep it off. And I literally slept, I think, like 10 hours last night and no sore throat. And I feel pretty amazing at this point. Just quick note for the listener, because I think you'll have valuable thoughts on the ability of like a good night's sleep when you need it and swallowing your ego and pride, and the ways that can solve soreness, fatigue, sickness. Sleep is superpower. I'm sure you're right on it one of these days.
No, it is a super. I mean, if you were going to the science, I think I brought this up when we did it in episode two, the 2 episodes ago. I was telling a story about a study where they intentionally injected willing participants with the rhinovirus, which is the common cold, and then they had them sleep differing amounts at night. And those who slept for like 5 or 6 hours a night were significantly more likely to contract the virus, and the other ones were able to have strong enough immune systems to fend it off. I think in general, the accumulation of sleep, like day after day, week after week, matters more than one anomaly where you miss the mark. But you're never going to really go wrong by trying to right the ship and sleeping a little bit later and giving your body rest when it needs it. So um, I I think there's probably cellular and physiological processes that we could talk about, which may have caused that to kind of calm down and or disappear. But I think you made the right decision.
Sleep, I think I've heard is like if you bottled it up as a drug, it would be like the most profitable, most expensive, greatest discovery of all time. And yet we a lot of times neglect the very thing that is totally within our control. So, anyways, as it relates, I think one of the best things you can do during a taper is sleeping. And the first edition to cover today is the science of a taper, how shedding fatigue reveals your fitness and primes your body for peak performance. Take us into this one. I think last time we actually ended kind of on a taper. So this was kind of like a two-part series within the newsletter on tapering.
That's exactly right. We ended last time talking about the mindset behind a taper and how so many runners have this overpowering fear of rest because, for good reason, they cultivate the mindset during the season of, I need to put in more work. I will be okay with having sore and tired legs tomorrow if that means in 6 weeks I can actually be in better shape. But at some point in time, that logic reverses, and you actually need to back off your training in order to express the fitness that's underlying. And so this really was a part two newsletter that where I wanted to talk about the mechanics of it. Like it's great in broad strokes to understand what a taper is. Most people know, okay, that means I should do a little less volume, but there's all these different dials that you can turn and there's these different levers that you can pull. And I wanted to specifically talk about, okay, which ones do you need to pull and what does the science suggest is the most optimal way to do that? So we could kind of go one by one and I can give some general advice on each of those categories.
I like how in the beginning you just started with what is a taper and you kind of went into the science of that. Let's speak to what is a taper for someone who is kind of new to the sport, as well as I think a lot of people who are like new runners or in high school have these understandings about these sort of subjects that aren't always completely right. For instance, one of them being, oh, a taper is just I cut all my mileage the final week of the championship race. And if someone was to say that to you, I'm sure your jaw would drop and you'd say, no, 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 no. That's not a proper taper.
It's a little more nuanced than that. The scientific definition, the best scientific definition that I found was that tapering is a technique designed to reverse training-induced fatigue without compromising training adaptations. And to kind of understand what that statement is saying, we have to go back to the relationship between um, stress plus rest equals growth, right? Training itself damages you. It leaves you dehydrated, depleted. You have micro tears in your muscles, and better fitness lies on the other side of recovery, and you can't shortcut that process. So the way I think about it sometimes is that after a really big session or after a really big race, you're both more fit and more fatigued, and there's a very important distinction between those two things. Fitness is something that is a more durable characteristic over time. the deterioration in fitness is a lot slower than the deterioration in fatigue. So for instance, after that big workout, you might have learned that you're in the best shape of your life, but you're way too tired to repeat that effort again the next day. Your true fitness is actually being masked by that exhaustion, by that fatigue. So then performance ultimately becomes, can you shed that fatigue while maintaining that fitness? And ultimately that becomes a game of trying to figure out timing of when do I invest that hard work where I get maximal returns? And then how do I back off my training in such a way that I can maintain the fitness and then have the largest gap between fitness and fatigue, which there's a nice little graph that kind of shows that if you read the newsletter. One metaphor, just to make this a little bit simpler, I like to think of fitness as the sun and fatigue as the clouds. When you're training really hard, it's like an overcast day. The sun's always there, it's always shining, but the clouds kind of obscure that fitness. The sun's always there, it's always waiting for you, but the goal of a taper is to let those clouds part and let the fitness shine through at the right moment.
I'm going to ask you maybe some more broad questions that the newsletter addresses, but kind of leave the thickness and the depth of science to the actual piece and allow the listener right now, if they haven't read it, to go read the piece itself. Would you say tapering is overrated or underrated? And do you think that answer changes depending on the event, marathon versus mile?
Yeah, it's probably an it depends question. The deeper you go in training, as in the more fatigue that you incur, the more a taper will be beneficial. For someone running 15 to 20 miles a week, you have nothing to taper from. So in that case, just maintaining the training.
At my training for this marathon.
For those who don't know, Dom is running a marathon in a few weeks, I think, and he's running like 15 miles a week. He shouldn't taper. It's not going to do you any good. You're going to get less fit. There's obviously a point where when you back off training for long enough, that's not just tapering, that's detraining. So no, you don't want to get to that point. So anyway, it is probably a nuanced question where it depends on the event that you're running. The more volume you accumulate, probably the more important a taper is. Also, it's important to mention here that for the most important races of the year, for those running at the Olympic trials, the NCAA championships, high school nationals, whatever it may be, like your master's championship, you're going to execute probably a proper taper for that one race. But there's plenty of other tune-up races or secondary races throughout the year where you don't necessarily want to taper every time, because then you get this oscillating training between like peak, drop, peak, drop, peak, drop, and like that becomes a little bit destabilizing. So most people will pick one or two big races where they're like, okay, I'm going to design a training program around this, and I'm going to be fully fresh for these efforts. Otherwise, I'm going to, quote, train through them. And so in those cases, just backing off for a couple of days might be sufficient.
Part of the reason I asked that question is because I think if you observe the best high school, college, professional runners, and I can even speak to this in my own career, a lot of times you run really fast in the midst of heavier training. And then you get to race day and you're doing faster workouts and less mileage, and you don't necessarily perform as well. What's the thought behind this? And also, what would you say to a runner, specifically in cross country season, maybe a psychological mindset shift of like, look, try to run fast like every race, because if that's the intent or goal for high school cross country, generally it is, like you can run fast in the midst of heavy training normally.
You can, and the perspective you're introducing right here would definitely suggest that for some people, tapering is probably overrated. We're talking very small margins. Like if you look at the research, you might be able to get 2 to 3% out of a taper at its best. But that's not like, I mean, for elites, that's sometimes a significant margin. But for most people, I mean, there are other factors that might play a larger role, and we'll get into this in the next conversation about the hierarchy of endurance needs, that, you know, tapering sits at the top of the hierarchy of needs. Like if there's, again, tapering reveals fitness that has already been built, but if you haven't built that fitness, it's not going to do you any good. So I wish, actually, I'm currently working on a newsletter, which is going to be published on Thursday, August 28th, which is about how improvement is not very predictable in our sport. And there was a group of coaches surveyed. I think it was like 100 coaches were surveyed confidentially, and they were asked, to what degree do you think that you can predict an athlete's response to either a training session or a training block? And only 13% of coaches said that they could often predict that. And these were pretty experienced coaches, which just makes you scratch your head and wonder, like, wow. So like we sit down at the beginning of the season, we map out this perfect plan, and we have this training volume that builds up into this crescendo and then tapers off right before a big race. And it's like that taper and like where we're supposed to be on day 100 of 100 of the plan doesn't always deliver the best results that we can. So to your point, if you're early in your career and you're just building volume and you're just trying to get better at racing, be opportunistic. Every chance that you get to run fast, you should take it. You don't want to kind of wait for the perfectly engineered scenario to run fast because hey, I mean, for those who watched the Diamond League last week, you could get Lassonde type conditions where it's like raining buckets and you're not going to run fast on that day. Now, of course, running fast is not all that matters. Winning is and competing is important, but I like the way you're thinking about that because sometimes we kind of like over index on the taper and forget about there are other important things in training and racing.
Yeah, or we just think that we need certain conditions or yeah, specifically with training to run fast. And I don't know. I go back to I think it was my junior year of high school. I was hitting workouts really well and I was really fit. And as I got to early cross country season, I kind of had this mindset shift, which was I'm really fit. So if I run hard during my workouts, the splits will be good rather than chasing the splits. And it kind of goes to my conversation with Mike Scannell, where he prescribes a lot of effort to his athletes rather than pace. And it's like, it's the same thing with racing. Just like race hard. And if the fitness is there, the time's going to be good. And you don't have to overcomplicate training or racing, which a lot of times we do. And I also think, in my opinion, it is very event specific. Like Ethan, the kid I'm coaching, he, you know, a lot about like the difference in ability of racing at 85 miles a week, hitting hard workouts and long run. Like he's very fatigued. And the workouts are going to be infinitely better as we get closer to the marathon. With the 5K, 10K, 1500, like, yeah, you're training fatigued, but the marathon is a way more technical game in terms of like fatigue is kind of the name of the game. And it's just a different, like the workout, I almost place more emphasis on the workouts if you're training for a 5K, 10K, and I almost place more emphasis on like the mileage and ability to endure fatigue for a marathon. I don't know if I'm thinking of that wrong, but I think tapering is a massive conversation in the marathon. Like everyone talks about tapering 3 weeks out. You don't really hear that for USAs with an athlete at the Portland Track Festival. And they're like, oh, time to hit the taper hard for USAs. You don't really hear that as much.
No, not as much. You're right. Um, to just kind of go back to your original question of kind of keeping some of the technical details for those who have read the newsletter, I'm going to try to give like a 2 or 3 sentence overview of some of the general takeaways from tapering, and then there's one concluding note where I want to go. Um, the biggest lever you should pull in tapering is volume. If you're going to change anything in your training repertoire, you want to drop the volume. Some people would even say drop it as much as 40 to 60%. So if you're running 75 miles a week, I mean, you might drop that down to like 35 or 40 miles. You might bottom out at that at the end. You don't want to cut your volume in half overnight. You want what's generally referred to as an exponential taper, where you do a bigger drop in the beginning of that, 10 to 14 day period, and then it kind of levels out and stays low after that. I just mentioned the timing. Most people will taper in a window that's typically 7, 10, or 14 days. That's generally agreed upon as a good time frame. Um, in terms of frequency, if you run on average about 7 days per week, you probably don't want to change that too much because the body gets pretty used to a rhythm. Maybe you can go and take one extra off day, but like if you're someone who's running, 11 or 12 times per week, which insinuates that you're doubling, and some of those doubles might purely be in the plan just to add, to bolster the mileage. You can take some of those doubles away, but you probably don't want to change the frequency of your running by about more than 80%. That's what the studies show. The biggest thing to keep in mind in tapering is that you don't want to drop your intensity. You have to maintain the race pace stimulus to keep you sharp. Study after study has shown that like if you drop volume but maintain intensity, you can potentially get better. If you reduce intensity and you preserve the volume, you don't really get much better at all. So you always want to drop the intensity. And then lastly, and this is kind of going into the nuance that you mentioned of both the person and the event, there is some evidence out there and it's relatively emerging. So I'm not going to like plant my flag in the ground here and stand behind this statement wholeheartedly. But there's some emerging evidence that if you are a fast twitch muscle fiber dominant type of person who relies on a lot of speed and power, you have those muscle fibers, those fast twitch muscle fibers kind of get selectively more fatigued when training hard with a lot of volume, and they might actually have a stronger rebound effect from a taper. If you're someone who's a slow twitch dominant athlete, those are really robust muscle fibers. They don't really fatigue. They're very, very fatigue resistant. So if you're someone who knows you have a lot of speed and power, it might be worth experimenting with a little bit more of a dramatic taper just to see what happens, because you might actually revitalize those muscle fibers and you get a little bit more pop back. The last thing I wanted to say, just to kind of conclude this piece, is the last subtitle on this piece is know when to break the rules. I told the story of when I was a senior in high school, the Connecticut state champion, the state open meet was the same week as New Balance Outdoor Nationals in North Carolina. I tripled at the state meet because we had a chance to win, which we actually did. I ran the 4x8, the 1600, and the 3200. And then 2 days later, came back, ran and won the 5K at New Balance Outdoor Nationals, ran a huge PR of 14:16. And then 48 hours later, ran the DMR and PR'd and ran 4:06. Nothing in conventional training theory or science would tell you that you'd be at your best after 5 races in 6 days. And yeah, maybe I wasn't at my best. Maybe I could have run another second or two faster, but you don't necessarily want the science and the guidelines of a taper to be constraining if you have opportunities to do something amazing. So it's about knowing when to follow the playbook and knowing when to deviate. And if there are opportunities to do something really special, believe in your body's resilience, believe in your ability to do it. And like, you can probably throw away some of the tapering principles just to maximize your opportunities while you have them.
Great thoughts, great points. I actually think this would be a good tradition to take forward with us in future podcasts, recapping newsletters, is reading a favorite comment from one of the editions. And I think this one was my favorite. This person's name on Substack is Davey the Black Dog. Very interesting.
I actually know who this is, but I'll keep him anonymous.
Okay. He said, I love this. You guys, famously, Sir Roger Bannister took 5 full days off from running before becoming the first human to break a 4-minute mile. Something interesting I've noticed through my career personally is the fragility of aerobic fitness and the consistency of anaerobic fitness. What I mean by this is that if I stop running for a month, strength and lactic buffer have a longer half-life than my aerobic fitness. This was put on full display during my plebe summer at the Naval Academy. I was 18 in boot camp. 6 weeks prior, I'd run a 151 at Brooks PR. Then I went through 6 weeks of boot camp for the Navy and ironically put on 13 pounds. At the plebe summer smoker on an indoor track, I ran a 153.1. Absolutely no running, training for 6 weeks. If you asked me to do the equivalent for 5K, no shot, at least for me. Just interesting, no factual or data-driven anecdotes over here, just observation. I thought that was a really good comment, fun story.
Yeah, if there's any sprinters listening to the podcast, you can consider yourselves lucky because some of the neuromuscular adaptations that you need to run really, really fast and some of the anaerobic fitness required to do the 100, the 200, or the 400, those are things that can be built up extremely quickly. And aerobic fitness relies on literally building more blood vessels. You need increased vascularization in the muscle. You need to build more mitochondria, build more red blood cells. Those are kind of adaptations that take a really long time to build. And when you lose them, like, you can't rely on them to kind of support your performance. So I'd say this comment is definitely directionally correct. And also, again, individualized per the person.
Alex, I'm going to break the rules today. And I think we are going to skip one newsletter and go from 1 to 3 because I think they connect pretty well. And I think a lot of the things we just said relate to this. So the hierarchy of endurance needs, how to prioritize training that delivers the biggest gains. Walk us through this one.
Sure. So at a high level, as people out here know who are listening to this, I rely heavily on sports science to try to draw conclusions. And sports science as an industry is not perfect. A lot of times we rely on studies that have small sample sizes. A lot of it is college-aged men, not women. And you're taking people off the couch and you're giving them a training intervention and you're like, let's just see how much you improve. And of course, if you take someone off the couch, a lot of people will improve. So I say that because in order to draw good conclusions from research, you need a couple of things. One, you typically need large sample sizes where you test things over and over again, and you're able to actually draw firm conclusions about what the intervention and the outcome that you're measuring is giving you. And the other thing is the effect size. So the magnitude of the effect of what you're testing. And so I always look for, like, okay, if somebody goes to altitude, they're going to get maybe a 3, 4, or 5% improvement in hemoglobin mass, which is one isolated metric which can improve your performance. If you run more volume, and you go from 30 miles a week to 50 miles a week, I can guarantee you the percent change and improvement is going to be so much greater than that. So it really introduces the question, training is not a maximization problem. You don't want to take every variable and turn the dial up to 10. You really need to figure out what are the most important things, where do I spend most of my effort, and what things can I neglect until I've already developed a good foundation. So there's a nice little conceptualization of this. For those who took psychology in high school or college, you might remember something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which basically tracks like what humans need to feel fulfilled. And at the base level of the pyramid, the most important thing is you need food, safety, and shelter before you go up the pyramid and you can go towards like self-actualization, pursuing your goals, doing things at a really high level. If you don't have the things at the bottom of the pyramid, things at the top don't count for anything. So, from that perspective, there's a sports scientist. He's an American born but Norwegian based sports scientist named Steven Seiler, who came up with this idea of what is the hierarchy of endurance needs? What are the most foundational elements? And then as we move up that pyramid, which are the things that which are still important but become less of an emphasis if you've neglected the base. Um, that's the overview. I'm gonna hand it back to you.
What to you is so at the bottom you have high training volume and frequency, high intensity training, intensity balance, periodization, weekly structure, marginal gains, race specific, and then at the top, as you mentioned, tapering. Which do you think is the biggest one that people neglect?
Yeah, I think that we're drawn as a society to intensity, and we neglect the fact that consistency and just volume day in and day out and just stacking those bricks is probably the most important thing. There's one study I was just talking earlier about like effect size and sample size. There was a study that surveyed over 2,000 recreational marathoners, and it found that weekly volume was the strongest predictor of race performance. So for those people who were running 50 miles a week, they were 25 to 32 minutes faster than those running 30 miles per week, all else equal. And then if you go down and you look at intensity, those same people were sampled, and they found that in that same group of marathoners, those who incorporated intervals regularly, so those who were doing intensity beyond just easy mileage, they only ran about 5 minutes faster. Still important, still meaningful, but way secondary to the gains that you can get from volume alone. So I would just say to people, it's that, without sufficient volume as the foundational layer, everything else that you layer on top of it is going to have a more limited impact. So you have to prioritize high volume. If you're a new runner, just focus on like building good volume consistently day in and day out. Intensity is important. You're going to do it. Everyone wants to do it. Everyone's drawn to the big, sexy workouts, but don't neglect the value of just, running mileage. It's really important.
It's kind of like what Milt said on my podcast with him this past week, which was like, people ask what we did with Ethan Strand this year. And he's like, the same thing we did the last 3 years. And I loved his analogy, kind of comparing it to a stock, like in the S&P 500 and just those index fund, like just those gains over time. You do the same thing day in, day out. Eventually, you're going to see the results. And that's where I think consistency is so underrated. Chris Williamson has this great quote where he's like, consistency won't guarantee success, but not being consistent will almost guarantee failure, which I absolutely love.
100%. As we move up, I'll talk about kind of the three foundational layers and this is where there's definitely the most evidence behind it. Volume, the second layer is intensity. The third layer is the intensity balance, or sometimes called the intensity distribution. Some people listening to this may have heard of a concept called polarized training, which is something that was pioneered by Steven Seiler. And it's this idea of like the 80-20 principle. 80% of your sessions should be very easy, 20% should be very hard. And you don't really want that many sessions to be in the middle, where like there's typically what Seiler says is there's this black hole training intensity where most people get kind of pulled into the middle, which is really a gray zone. It's a training intensity where, if you're a weekend warrior or if you're someone who doesn't have a ton of time to devote to the sport, you will go out and you'll run really, really hard, even on your easy days, just because you feel like you're getting more out of it and it feels productive. But what the science supports and what I've seen is that I think often that leads to stagnation, because those runs that become moderately hard all the time are too hard to recover from, but they're too easy to provoke meaningful adaptation. There's a study, and I'm quoting this off of memory, but I think it was from Ball State, which looked at the difference between what the prescription of a coach was and what the execution of the athlete was on average. And most coaches would prefer that their easy days be like, on a scale of 1 to 10 on intensity, like a 2 or a 3. And the athletes reliably were always like 3.5 to 4 out of 10. And then on the hard sessions, the problem is if you take those easy sessions too hard, you're actually stealing energy from the hard sessions and you're not able to go hard enough. And so the same athletes were like, when they were prescribed a 7 or 8 out of 10, they were something like a 6.5 and again, I'm quoting this off of memory, but directionally that's what it was. So in a culture that definitely celebrates no pain, no gain, we have to recognize that there needs to be some safeguards against overtraining and overcooking ourselves. And when you're an athlete who's dealing with both a lot of volume and intensity, you have to recognize that there's a trade-off there. You can't turn all those dials up to 10 at the same point in time. Like I said earlier, you have to know that you have to protect the easy volume, and then when it is time to go hard, you can go hard, but you have to have a balance between the two.
Any final notes on this newsletter before we move on? And again, to the listener, I think these are two pieces that are so well worth reading and a little harder to conceptualize audibly, like Alex is trying to do, whereas the next two we're about to go through are a little easier. So highly recommend reading these pieces, taking notes.
Yeah, no, I'll just conclude by saying that I've written a lot about training is essentially us coaches and athletes making hypotheses about what will work, and there's certain things that are strategies that are higher probabilities of success than others. There's certain decisions you make that give you a higher return on investment, where a small input will potentially yield a larger output. And I think this model and this idea of thinking about training reinforces that. The base training, the base of the pyramid, isn't complicated, but it delivers. And the higher you go up the pyramid, once you get to like heat training, once you get to altitude training, once you get to tapering, once you get to the exact specifications of how you structure your week, those ultimately may be important, but they're going to yield much smaller gains. So when in doubt, always return to the base.
How long I'm in the cold plunge doesn't matter?
I'm sorry to tell you that does not really matter. It's marginal at best. It's marginal at best. So remember that, remember that the pyramid only stands when the foundation is strong.
I love it. Okay, moving on. When the magic fades, the unrepeatable nature of success and why progress means moving forward, not looking back. Coach Milt, I think the first episode we ever did with each other, had a viral reel. Part of the episode I turned into a reel. I think it got hundreds of thousands of views, which I think means it resonated with a lot of people. And it is the line that you opened up this newsletter with, which is my college coach, Chris Miltenberg, used to say, the hardest season of your career is the one after you get really good.
Yeah. And then I say it's a counterintuitive truth, but I've seen it time and time again. The thing is that when you're on the upswing and you're improving rapidly, every week you're like knocking out a new personal best. You're beating people that you've never beaten before. It's so easy to ride that momentum to the top. There's really no pressure in being the underdog. You're just discovering how good you can be. You're shocking yourself and others every step that you go. When that season is over and you're actually forced to hit the pause button, there's no more races to worry about. The dust settles. All of a sudden, you are no longer the underdog. You are the one with the target on your back. And everyone loves to look up at the people who are on the throne before and say, man, I would love to be there. But they don't realize how heavy the crown is when they ultimately wear it themselves. And so when you get to the top and you've had a really good season, whether that's relative to your peers or relative to yourself, same thing applies. That success stops feeling magical in the way that it did when you're on the come up, and it starts feeling fragile because you feel like you have to protect that position. You have to defend your spot on the throne, and everybody else is coming for you. And so I think ultimately that leads people into a very common trap that I've noticed, which is that when you have that dream season and you have those periods of time where everything kind of feels effortless and that confidence just comes week after week, there's going to come a point where that ends. And when that ends, the natural reaction is, oh, I'm just going to try to copy and paste what got me there in the first place. And that never works, or that rarely works, I should say. Like trying to replicate every single variable, the sessions, the rest, the tapers, the routines. We just assume that if we replay that tape, we're going to get the same ending every time. And that's just not how the human body and that's not how training works.
One of the first sections you cover is you never step in the same river twice. And you write, every elite athlete has a dream season when everything clicks, when everything they touch turns to gold. And these periods races feel effortless and confidence compounds. But when the next season rolls around and the results don't come as easily, many try to reverse engineer that prior success. They replicate every variable, same session, same taper, same routines, as if replaying the tape will yield the same ending. But as the Greek philosopher, I don't even know if I want to attempt that name.
It's a Greek philosopher. I don't know how to say his name either.
Herculides wrote, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he is not the same man. The athlete has changed, the environment has changed, and pretending otherwise is an exercise in false control. So I kind of stated what you wrote. So my follow-up question off of this is, with the knowledge as the listener now, you never step in the same river twice. How do you go about constructing trying to be better than you were before, knowing that your variables have changed and that you can't just copy and paste what made you good before.
Yeah, exactly. I listened to the podcast you did with Coach Milt about a week ago. Everyone should listen to it. I listened to it twice. I probably got 10 new newsletter ideas out of it. So you'll be seeing those ideas recycled in another format at some point in time. And he talks about a really important distinction between changing and evolving. And I don't know if he just thought of that on the spot or if he is drawing that from somebody else, but changing implies I'm going to take what I've done in the past and completely discard it and throw it out. There's probably a time and a place for that, but there's also this idea of evolving from where you were in a prior state, which is let me look at where I was, zoom out, look at what worked, and then figure out how am I going to tweak the things that I need to tweak to get even better than I was. There's a great concept, which is that, in business, in mastery, what gets you from 0 to 10 is not what gets you from 90 to 100. What got you here won't get you there. And I think we have to all recognize that we have to evolve from our prior states in order to meet the new demands of who we are as a person and what the world is asking of us, because those things are never exactly what they were when you experience success that one time. Success is not that formulaic. It's not as simple as rinse and repeat. If it were, you would see a lot more repeat winners, and you just don't. It's very hard to stay on the top for a long period of time. One other thing that I'll add that I think contributes to this tendency that we have to try to repeat the past is that, we look at our memory is charmed when we look back at when we were at our best. The past is not as good as you remember it to be, because once the story ends, it's almost impossible to reconstruct how uncertain it felt when you were living in it. When you were living in it, you had all these open loops about the future that had not yet been resolved. And when you get to the end, everything is neatly and tidily packaged in your mind. And so memory, when we look back, you kind of smooth out the chaos, you smooth out the volatility, and you forget about the time when you rolled an ankle in the warm-up. You forget about the time that you didn't sleep for a week because you were nervous about the race, and you just remember the high points. And I love this idea that nostalgia is really memories minus the pain. And so you're not actually remembering a version of history that unfolded. You're really chasing a version of history that never truly existed because you're not remembering it correctly. So I would just remind everybody that if you really interrogate your thoughts and you think about what you went through at that time, it's probably not the first thing that pops into your head. It probably was harder, and it probably wasn't as smooth as you believed it to be.
Something we texted about this week that is honestly very applicable to what you write here is working with an athlete and figuring out, he isn't hitting workouts as well as he wants to. Just results in training aren't what he wants them to be or what he needs them to be training for a specific race and goal. I'm sure a lot of people listening are in similar positions because, as this newsletter writes about, not everyone is always having their dream perfect season or training block. What should an athlete do and where should they start when things aren't clicking? What questions should they ask themselves? What processes should they go down when they aren't necessarily having the season or the races that they desire? And or in that process, should they just realize and be aware that not necessarily every season is going to be a home run, and it's not fair to assume that will always be the case?
Yeah. I mean, by definition, outliers are outliers for a reason, and you can't have outliers every season, every time you try. So part of this is that, as we wrote about, going back to even the first newsletter we published, the breakthrough fallacy, you spend a lot of time on that plateau before things click together, and you're building up all this potential energy for the right variables to intersect at the right moment in time for you to actually have a breakthrough. So some of that is like, you just have to be able to put your head down and be patient. The other question you asked is probably a newsletter itself, which is, when things aren't going well, where do you start to look? And I'll give you a couple of thoughts and then actually write about this in the future at some point in time, because really we should have a mental checklist of things that you should look at if things aren't really delivering the way you expect. On balance, most people listening to this podcast are probably hard workers. They're probably type A people. They're perfectionists. They're probably more likely to be overcooked than they are undertrained. And one of the hardest things to differentiate between in the sport is the symptoms of overtraining and not being fit enough mirror one another. You might feel like, you're breathing really hard. You might feel like you've got heavy legs. And that could be one of two scenarios. One, you could have just pushed a little bit too hard, or two, you might just not have the proper fitness in order to do the work yet. So I'd say resting and backing off usually is a pretty safe solution. because of what this population tends to do. We tend to overwork ourselves. The other place you probably should go, and this involves kind of getting medical support, would be, I think, like a comprehensive blood panel usually is pretty good at diagnosing some of the clues. Um, there are things that are sometimes hiding in plain sight. Iron deficiency, like anemia. You could have an underlying infection that you don't realize. You could have disrupted thyroid function, or you could have low testosterone or estrogen. Some of those things could be from underfueling. Some of those things could be from overtraining. So I think when in doubt in training, rest more, probably eat more, make sure you're covering all of your micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, especially iron. And then as a last line of defense, go chat with a doctor, and ideally chat with a doctor who understands athletes. A sports medicine doctor would probably be able to answer your questions more than a general practitioner.
Any final notes from When the Magic Fades before we move on to the final piece?
Um, one thing that I say is I conclude by saying don't optimize for nostalgia. I feel like there's some teams, and I'm not going to fault them for doing this, but there's a lot of teams that try to copy and paste their workouts from year to year because they're these major indicator workouts. And I have noticed, and Jerry Schumacher, he's my head coach, who I coach with, reminds me often that repeating workouts before major championship races can be a little bit dangerous, because the risk of emotional comparison, especially because you're not remembering the version of history that actually unfolded, you're remembering a version of your memory that's been airbrushed. That emotional comparison, definitely the risk of that outweighs the benefit of beating your historical data. And so I would just say, when we think about training and when we think about evolving, trying to recreate that exact sequence that led you to past success is like trying to walk the same path through a maze that's already shifted. You don't necessarily want to go backwards. You need to evolve forwards. You need to open new doors and be willing to try some new strategies. Because again, repeating a dream season is next to impossible. Success isn't really a formula. It doesn't get recreated. It has to get reimagined.
Final piece we're covering today, the hidden behaviors behind championship teams, 4 traits that define high performing cross country teams. I think this is the most or second most viewed post. And so I think it resonated with a lot of people. What are those key traits of the most successful championship teams, Alex?
Yeah, so I'll just give a little bit of context. I started this newsletter off by telling a story of when I first got to Stanford after the whirlwind of compliance meetings and team physicals and whatnot. We actually packed up and went to Mammoth Lakes, California for a 2 or 3 week training camp before the season actually started. And sometime in the middle of camp, the senior members of the team called a team meeting with no coaches present. And they said, like, okay, this is our opportunity to set the standards of what we want to do on our own terms. And I literally got goosebumps in that meeting because I had always assumed that like we took directions from the top. And of course, anyone listening to this podcast knows that like Coach Milt was an integral part of creating that team and that team culture and the personnel on that team. But to have ownership from within the team itself and to say, this is the language we're going to use in workouts. This is the way we're going to carry ourselves when things don't go well. These are kind of the principles and maxims that we're going to live by as a group. That to me was so transformational because I had never assumed that like that could come from the team itself. We had an incredible collection of talented individuals in that room. We had Foot Locker finalists. We had people who had we had some people who had broken 4 minutes in the mile, even in high school at the time, before that was more normal. We had, Foot Locker finalists, everything. And I think what we recognized is that any team that has talent might be able to catch lightning in a bottle and hit it big one time. And they might be able to podium at cross country nationals. They might be able to win. But this was a team that had been second the year before, and we weren't satisfied with second. We wanted to stay on top, and we wanted to be there for a long time. And I think we recognized that culture was the thing that was going to keep us up there. And I think culture can be a little bit of a nebulous topic, but I broke it down into some of the key behaviors that I think are often overlooked, and we can kind of go through those one by one.
What do you think for you writing this piece was the most surprising trait that you wrote on that you think most people reading would be like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that as being a trait of a championship team?
Yeah, I wrote this section called Push from the Bottom. And to just tell a brief story, everyone who's run knows how long track meets can be, whether it's outdoor track or indoor track or cross country, and there's always like a series of B races before the big championship race. And most people will overlook that race because it's essentially an exhibition match. But there was this weird coincidence with timing where every year in college we would go to Madison, Wisconsin to run the Nuttycombe Invitational, which was the biggest kind of mid-season checkpoint and race before nationals. All the big players were always there. And the B race, so typically people on the roster who were like 8, 9, 10, 11, like the 4 people who didn't make the championship race would go there. And they would race, and we'd typically always be stepping off the bus watching those people race and finish. And one thing that Coach Milt always told us was the B race sets the tone for the championship race. When you step off that bus and you see the 10th best guy on the team pouring his heart and soul into that race with no points on the line, like that is to me the best litmus test of a team culture, because you have someone who believes in the mission who can't even actively contribute it at that point in time. And how far that last runner is willing to go sets the tone to me more so than what the people on top do. I think most people will look up the hierarchy for cues. They try to emulate their stars. But in really, really strong cultures, the standards are set at the bottom and you push from the bottom rather than pulling from the top. It's this idea of the rising tide lifting all boats, right? And the strength of a team is not always measured by its star power, but how far its last runner is willing to go. And I think when everybody feels important to the mission and you can see that and you can feel it, that's a pretty special thing.
Something you wrote on in this piece that I've seen across all sports and the top people on the top teams across all sports is this notion of leaving the jersey or the program in a better place than you found it. I think that's just a sure way to success as an athlete, because it immediately puts yourself in this grand scheme and scope of this is bigger than myself and I'm a contributing member to it. And I have a role and responsibility to leave this program in a better place than I found it. And I also think that's just a very manageable goal that anyone can set for themselves, because it isn't predicated just on how fast you run, but the culture that you create, the friendships you forge, what you make that school out to be. Can you elaborate on this point and how, whether you're in middle school, high school, college, even on a professional team listing, that you do have a duty to leave the jersey, leave the program in a better place than you found it?
Yeah. I mean, we all have our moment in the sun, right? And then we're all going to kind of fade into irrelevance eventually. And I think something that's really powerful to the human mind, and it probably goes back to our tribal roots, is we love investing in kind of self-transcendent tasks and purposes. And one of the things that Coach Milt always used to say is what we do today will like echo through the generations of future Stanford runners. The standards that we set today, the things that we do are going to be planting the seeds for future growth that we'll maybe never get to see, but we'll know we've been a part of. One of my favorite things that happens is whenever UNC, or at the time Stanford, well, actually it's only been UNC, and I was in part of the first class that got there, or second class, I guess, that got there after Coach Milt started the program there and started to revitalize it in 2019 to 2020. Whenever someone will do something big at UNC now, there will always be a group text that starts to light up, whether it was Parker or Ethan doing something big or making the national meet for the first time. There's always a text from Coach Milt that will say something like, don't remember, like, this is the legacy that you guys built. You were a part of starting this thing that now finally has gotten into motion. And I think feeling connected to the generation of runners that will ultimately wear that jersey, you know you have a chance to wear it and rent it temporarily, but you're contributing to something greater than yourself, really is awesome. And there's a quote that I can't help but share. It's by a guy named Vernon Jordan. He says, "You are what you are today because you stand on somebody's shoulders. And wherever you're heading, you can't get there by yourself. If you stand on the shoulders of others, you have a reciprocal responsibility to live your life so that others may stand on your shoulders. It's the quid pro quo of life. We exist temporarily through what we take, but we live forever through what we give. And we live forever through what we give." And to me, that's just such a powerful concept. And I think everyone on any team, no matter what degree of success that you have, that's something that you can reach for and you can invest in.
Any final takeaways from this piece that people should directly apply into their specific teams they're respectively on today?
Just the last one, and this also appears in the newsletter, is this concept of sweeping the sheds. I took that from a book called Legacy, written by James Kerr. He profiled a season with the All Blacks, which is a rugby team based in New Zealand. They were the winningest team in rugby history at the time. Um, the notable lesson to take there is that everyone needs to have the humility to be able to do the small things well. In rugby terms, the shed referred to the locker room, and after every game the best athletes would go into the locker room and start sweeping the locker room and cleaning it up. This wasn't something that they left for the janitors to do. This wasn't like a publicity stunt for the cameras. It was just the way things were done on their team, because the message was no one's above the work. Everyone takes responsibility for it. And there's no double standards here. The best players don't get to sidestep the rules, and they don't get special treatment. And I think that humility, ultimately, humility in the small things is really important. Because it's not something that necessarily directly shows up in results on race day, but it sets the tone for who you are and what you want to do. There's a James Clear quote where he says, it's brief. He says, ambition is defined by when you close the gap between your circumstances and your expectations. And entitlement is when you expect others to close that gap for you. And entitlement is like a disease on a team. It's contagious. You don't want to be expecting other people to do things for you. You don't want to be above those things. You want to make sure that everybody, no matter what their status is on the team, is willing to contribute through those small details. So I'd say don't forget about that and have the humility to approach those things and take them seriously.
If you listen to this, you enjoyed it, you enjoyed some of the concepts, I will leave probably 2 links in the show note description where you can subscribe to The Rundown by The Running Effect, written by Alex. And you're missing out if you're 48 minutes into this podcast and you are not subscribed to that. We come out with a new newsletter every Thursday. And again, if you stuck around for 48 minutes, it shows you're interested in this stuff enough. And if you're not subscribed to the newsletter, why not give it a try for a week? The beauty of it is it's completely free. So if you don't enjoy it, you can unsubscribe. But Alex, I think we could see in the back end in the analytics, really no one's unsubscribing. We're only getting more subscribers. And so through that, I hope that you realize we can provide you hopefully a lot of value. And so if you're not subscribed, I would greatly appreciate you giving us a chance at providing you value weekly. And I hope we've done that today on this podcast. Ending with some more value. Alex, what's one high leverage thing that the listener can do in this next week that you believe will be helpful to their life or to their running? Homework for the people, besides subscribing to The Rundown.
You should subscribe if you want continually, hopefully high quality content. I think we live in a world, and this was put on display through a couple different newsletters, where we chase fads and we chase the latest and greatest technique. And I just always come back to, what are the timeless and time-tested principles that you can and should invest in? That goes back to like tapering being the last step in the training process. That goes back to the hierarchy of needs, where you have to focus on the foundational elements first. And then it just goes back to like, as human beings, what are the things that like give us purpose and that give us meaning? And that really works with team culture. And so I would just say, like, you have to be able to separate in today's day and age the signal from the noise. And there's going to be an influencer that's trying to sell a product or an idea that is probably going to have a half-life of a few days or a few hours, or maybe at best a few months. But there are some things that are durable. There are some things that really are meaningful over time. And I think if there's a common thread between these newsletters, it's that figure out what those things are. They may not be exciting, but man, do they deliver on the investment, and just do those things day in and day out.
I love it. Alex, go crush the best man speech, the Tokyo World Championships. And we'll talk after some more writing of yours, which I always also get a lot of value and insight from. And as always, appreciate your time and keep crushing it, man.
Thank you.